I'll introduce Martha. So I'm glad that so many of you guys came to Munch and Learn today. And so if you're not muted right now, go ahead and take the time to mute yourself. And also we are recording this presentation, so it will be added to our YouTube channel. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So you should do that so you don't miss any of the videos. We have videos that are just, educational videos, tours of exhibitions, and then we also have art activities and we have garden tours. So don't miss any of those videos. And now during the talk, when a question comes to mind, just take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen where it says chat and type in your question before you forget it. And then there will be time in the end where Martha can answer questions. So Martha Kelly, she grew up in Memphis. She attended Center College in Danville, Kentucky, and has made Memphis her lifelong home. And she had her first solo gallery exhibition in 1999, and since then has had many shows here in Memphis, as well as Sarasota, Florida, Black Mountain, North Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama, and Knoxville, Tennessee. She had her first museum show at the Dixon in 2015, and her second solo museum show will be at the Walter Anderson Museum of Art from January to July 2022. And Martha's first illustrated book, The Book of Common Worship for the Presbyterian Church USA, was published in April of 2018 and is included in the Illuminating the Word exhibition at the Dixon. She served as the Varnell Artist in Residence at the Memphis Theological Seminary from 2015 to 2017, and Martha maintains a home gallery of her paintings and prints in Midtown. You can call or email her to stop by and see her work. So I'm going to turn it over now to Martha Kelly.
Hey, y'all. Well, thank you. I'm going to apologize in advance. It was a rainy morning, so Mr. Darcy did not get his walk and is slightly more antsy than his normal lay on the couch and not make any noise. So hopefully we've already had the mail delivered, so hopefully it won't be bad. But if you hear anybody, that's him. And I'm delighted to be here. The two biggest, I'm really looking forward to Walter Anderson next year. That's my year's project once I get going again after the holidays. But the two biggest things of my career so far have been the solo show at Dixon and the Book of Common Worship. And it's this beautiful full circle that the Book of Common Worship is on display at Dixon. It just has brought it all around together in a very happily satisfying way for me. It also, I'm going to say it's really appropriate. It feels very appropriate to me to be included in this show because the St. John's Gospel, as anybody knows who's been to see this show, and it's stunning, is this 10, 15-year project, artists around the world. It's been this massive undertaking. And it inspired the Book of Common Worship. So the book that I illustrated is for the Presbyterian Church USA. And they have a Book of Common Worship that ministers use to plan the services. You know, it's got sections on funerals and births and weddings, and not births, but weddings and baptisms and daily prayers and all of the different ways that you approach worship, all of the different occasions. And they've never had art before. And a couple of years ago when they were planning it, they said, we really want to include art this time. They had been seeing all of the St. John Gospel making the headlines and the images of it being shared around the world. And they said, we want, in a much more modest way, because we don't have time for hand illumination and vellum, but we really want to have art. And they wrote me and they said, we would like you to illustrate it. And I just said, yes, please, that would be amazing. So getting to have the book next to St. John's Gospel feels really right. And I saw this show first in Omaha the year before it came to Dixon. And they had a whole series of French medieval manuscripts to sort of put it in the historical context for illuminated books, because nobody's really done one in 1,000 years or so. These were done all the time in the Middle Ages and not so much lately. And it really struck me standing in that space that in this tiny little square, I stand on this tiny little square in this big sweep of history of taking sacred text and making art and putting them together. And I think that's really a beautifully appropriate thing to do for several reasons. Kevin Sharp, director here, wrote out an email yesterday, as I had already been thinking about my talk, of course, and he talked about the beauty in daily life and really doubling down on the things that we have access to in our spaces right now that are art. And I love the idea of having beauty and words and worship kind of all come together. And the Book of Common Worship it's soft, it's petable. You can kind of carry it with you in your daily life. There's a tree pressed on the cover. You've got prayers, but you also really have beauty. And I think that is, especially this year, it is so important to have places like Leanne and I were talking about, things that we do in our houses and making beauty and surrounding ourselves with beauty for this year. There's another reason that art and text go really well together. There's a couple of more reasons. One is that I feel like, and I do this, there's so many really familiar passages that we get read in church, if church going. And I'm going to be talking, I'm primarily a landscape artist, but I do this work for the church periodically. And I'm primarily coming at it from my church persona because that is the show that we're dealing with. So there's a whole lot of stories that we've heard over and over and over again. And I find myself kind of sliding into this. Yeah. Okay. I know this one, but I have a picture in my head that is different than the picture in Lindley's head or anybody else's head. And if I can put my picture on paper for other people to see, I feel like that startles them out of the familiarity. It shifts that whole kaleidoscope, and even the words and the text have a different meaning, you get a different angle on them, and it makes them fresh and alive and new. And I think art at its best does that. I really hope landscape does that too, because I do a lot of work around here with the landscape that we have that's beautiful, that continues to get asphalted over. And one thing that art does is it connects that emotional heart response that I have, and it can bypass a whole lot of the intellectual verbiage and go straight to somebody else's heart. So we can talk about, for my landscapes, we can talk about global warming and the necessity of having trees and green space and floodplains and how that helps our earth. But if I can make a painting that reminds somebody of their family farm, then it bypasses that whole, we have to translate the heart into the words and tell the words to somebody else. And then you hope some of that trickles down to the heart, and you just go heart to heart. And I feel like art can do that. Music can do that. Drama can do that. Dance can do that. All of the arts have this real immediate emotional connection in a way that sometimes having to translate things into the intellect and then pass it to somebody else's intellect and hope that sort of trickles down doesn't. So I think having art married to text is really a service to all of us who want to see more deeply and who want to experience things with all the senses and who want to get different windows into these spaces, whether they're sacred, whether they're those spaces we live in. It always helps to do that. So those are the reasons that I feel like it's really important to have art and text. And just as a side note, I love that, like, Dickens had every book that he did illustrated. We need more illustrations for grownups. I don't think we outgrow the need for books and illustrations. I love to read books that are illustrated, and I think we need to get back to that. And there's a movement toward making books beautiful and sort of more touchable. And I hope that we get back to illustrations too. So I got to illustrate this book, and because I'm a landscape painter, I talked to them and I said, all right, for two reasons, I would really like to make this about landscape. And the first reason is very practical, because it is the best of the work that I do. And I want to give you the best work that I do. And that comes in a really long tradition of liturgical work. I got to go visit cathedrals and see that 100 years worth of artists bring their best work to God. And it's not just for us. It's really for the glory of God. They put these exquisite stained glass things way up in the clerestory, and nobody would be able to see them once they're up there. The stone carvings went way up high, some of them, and they were doing their best work for God. And I think that's important. But I also think landscape, the church, it's very easy. The church is run by people, and it's very easy to think about ourselves and our souls going somewhere else. But if you read the full book and the full text, like people don't show up till verse 26 in Genesis. And the whole earth reacts to this salvation history that is the story of the Bible. You know, you've got the plagues and Exodus, you've got the prophets, and the mountains are skipping like rams, the hills like lambs. When Jesus dies, you've got darkness and earthquakes, and the whole earth is involved. The whole earth responds. It's not just people. And I think it's easy to lose that sense of the whole earth, because we are the people and we're all up in our heads. So I really wanted to bring the landscape into the worship space. And I think, in this era right now, it's very important for us to remember that the earth is critical. The earth is something we're called to be stewards for. And just as a Christian, I feel very strongly that is one of the central things that we are called to do, is to not make it just about us, but to make it about everyone and everything. And so I really did want landscape in this book. Let's see. I'm going to show you. So I started with trees. Can I start sharing? Okay. Lindley is my moderator here. Let me get this going. I have made slides. Oh, good. Yay. And we're still on the first slide. Hallelujah. So I'm always, as a landscape painter, about the trees. It is always trees for me. I go and I paint other things, and I come back to trees, and I come back to the same trees, and I paint them over and over again, and I go meet new trees and I paint them. But it makes sense to me also because in the book, you've got the tree at the center of the garden at the very beginning, and you have the tree at the center of the city of God in Revelation at the very end. And so I said, can we have a tree on the cover? And they said, yes. And I was so delighted about that. And they did make, all right, okay, here we go. So here is the book as it looks, and the tree is pressed into the cover, and they just did a beautiful job. So it's obviously much more modest in scale than the St. John's Bible. It's a mass-produced book. But they did this very beautiful job of making something lovely for us to use in our daily lives, for ministers to carry out in their daily lives. And I was really grateful for that. I have put in a few slides of the Book of Kells because St. John's obviously echoes this illuminated tradition. And my dad, geek family that we were, raised us up drawing Celtic knotwork. And he would sit and he would doodle in boring meetings, and he would draw the knots and the over and the under. And I love this tradition of Celtic Christianity. Is beautiful. It is very creative. It is visually oriented. It's what I come out of, and the Celts are always what I'm looking to. But I love the beauty, but I also love that so many of the monks included themselves in small ways in these texts. They're self-portraits. Here I am with my paintbrush, and we haven't, as a culture, credited artists over the broader sweep of millennia. And I love that they were putting themselves in. They were writing commentaries in the margins. They were like, not sure how I feel about this. Not necessarily scripture, but probably. They were writing poems about themselves. There was one monk who wrote about himself and his cat Pangerban, and he was hunting words, and the cat was hunting whatever the cat was hunting that night. And you get these glimpses of the artist, and I got to do that too in this book. And I'm going to show you it. It's one of the privileges of being an artist, is that you get to include your personal things. And I think it makes it, writers talk about the universality of the particular. Like, you try to write generically and you think it suits everybody, but it doesn't really. It doesn't suit anybody, but you write your particular experience, and then everybody's like, oh, yes, I know that moment. I have lived that too. So I feel like it's important to bring the things that are the closest to my heart into this project. The other thing that I love about the Celts is I feel like the St. John's Gospel, and I'm going to talk some about that because I'm just so inspired by it, did this otherworldliness. very well that suits the idea of bringing the cosmos into a book. You know, there was very, very traditional, very realistic art through the Greco-Roman era. And then we feel like the Dark Ages happened and they lost all of that. And that's a piece of it because people traveled less and things circulated less in that Middle Ages. But I also feel like a lot of the artists took a very intentional step towards painting something that is otherworldly. So you get this flatness and you get color and you get gold leaf that is very cosmic. And they were living very difficult lives and they were inviting people into this otherworldly place. I don't think it was just that they lost all their skill. I think they were very intentionally creating a sense of the otherworldliness, of other spheres, and they were inviting people in during these times that were so difficult to where the saints were living in golden halo and this beautiful blue or whatever it was. I feel like the manuscripts do a beautiful job of bringing all of that otherworldliness that we catch glimpses of in the Bible, you know, the city at the tree at the center of the city, or Isaiah in the throne room of God and just seeing the feet peeping out of the robe. I feel like the artists bring us there. So I really love that Irish tradition. My working with text began some years ago at Idlewild, and I was the artist in residence, which is a purely volunteer position, but it was really gratifying to get to do some art for my church because I had grown up with this idea that artists in the community bring their best to the cathedral. And I thought, gosh, my church is done. I don't get to do anything, but I did get to do some projects with them. And one of the projects was I did 3 years worth of weekly bulletin drawings based on the scripture for the week. So I did the whole liturgical cycle, you know, year A, B, and C. And I got to sit with the text. And this is part of the translation, is you think about what is the most critical moment in that text. What is the visually arresting thing that I can do to make it come alive for people, to make them sort of see this text in a different way? And I also ended up with, look at the moons, you'll see these later, the trees. Does this look familiar? You know, I started with a series of motifs and a liturgical vocabulary, I guess, that carried over into this project. So I wanted to just show you a little bit. I also, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they shall be satisfied. I saw that as rain coming down. And I brought all of that sense of the abundance of God's world and the overflowing enormity of creation to this project. So you'll see some themes that carry forward. The project, very technically, unlike St. John's, which is on vellum and in paint, I'm going to flip forward a little bit. There we go. It's mostly black and white prints. I do printmaking. And so you can see the block on the left, and I cut away the white, and everything I leave, the ink sticks to. So it's like a big rubber stamp. And I did 16 of these plus the tree for the cover, one for the beginning of each section. And then let's see if I can go back. Yes, I can. And then they had these very small traditional symbols. And when they talked to me, they were thinking maybe I would do the symbols. And I thought, you know, I really want to do something that's richer and deeper than just that. So we ended up letting me pick a landscape for each section and then doing a smaller, more traditional symbol to pair with that landscape on the page. So I just wanted you to see that I was doing the small ones. We were on a deadline. So, and they've used them in beautiful ways. Again, it's not as formal as the St. John's, but I feel like the art editor put together a really beautiful book. So you can see that there's the big print and then there's the smaller Trinity, the 3 rings in the Trinity, and then 3 trees are standing in for the Trinity in the preface here. Here are the moons again. They made another appearance for the Christian year, just the progression of time and the celebration, I think, of something even larger than just the earth. And here, I'm going to go back to Ireland for a second. This is one of the places that I got to put in because it was personal to me and it was important. And they had a section for ancient prayers. And I thought, okay, this is where I want to include, this is the cross of moon. And since my 20s, this has been one of kind of the touchstones of my my spiritual art. It's one of the things that I saw early in my life, and it has just lived with me. I'm still, the quilt that I mentioned before we started is based on the cross of moon that I'm still working on, because in my 20s, it felt like a totally theology great geek thing to do, to make a quilt based on the scripture verses. And these are a lot like, here's the full cross, a lot of the stories around the base of it. And it's a lot like stained glass. You know, you had people who couldn't read and who needed the reminder of the stories. And so these are the 12 disciples. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace on top, with the angel with the wings above the furnace, ready to break them out of the furnace. You've got the flight to Egypt underneath with Mary on the donkey and the baby. You can see the baby's head next to her. Daniel in the lion's den is huge. They had these crosses all over Ireland, and they were the same. I feel like this is somewhat on topic, because they were the same time as the manuscripts. It was right about 900 that a ton of these were done, and right about then that the flowering of illuminated manuscripts, the ones, the Book of Kells, the ones that they felt a couple of generations must have been done by angels, because they were so intricate that they couldn't possibly have been done by people. That was this period. But I feel like, again, with the art, it not only taught the stories, but it also gave people a window into this otherworldliness. The people are not realistic, but it feels like you're sort of walking into this sacred space and this other holier place. And I loved that. So I wanted that cross to be in this book, because it's centuries worth of speaking out these stories to everyone and making them, bringing them into our daily lives. I'm going to tell you about the technicalities of it, because I always really like hearing the backstage story of how these things go. So they were kind of late in the process when they bring in an artist, which is how that usually works. And it's a huge project, but they had already decided that it was going to be black and red, because there's this whole history of black and red, you know, red letter Bibles and everything, and worship texts end up being black and red. And I had talked them into landscapes, and that went great. And then I started doing drawings, and I was really happy with the drawings. And then I started trying to put red in, and it looked like we'd hit Revelation and not the good parts. You know, if anybody has been to Shiloh and heard about the bloody pond, that is what I felt like I ended up with when I started doing these drawings and then trying to put red in. And I mean, I did a whole slew of them. I spent a couple of weeks panicking that I was not going to be able to do the work that I really wanted to do well for them. And I said, could we do purple? That's another liturgical color. Maybe we could just have purple on the art pages. And they were like, no, it has to be red. Finally, my partner, bless his fantastic heart, said, what about those Japanese prints that are black and white, but you have the little red chop in the corner that's the artist's signature? And I was like, thank you, that's awesome. So we ended up with a red border. And then the smaller symbol that we had already decided was going to be part of the page would be in the red. And then the main landscape would be black and white. And I settled into making the prints that I make black and white. This is you can tell it's a very quick early sketch. But what the process is, you know, church work is committees. And you see this in the St. John's Bible thing too. You know, the artists did these mock-ups, and this is my favorite part of the show, y'all, is you can see the collages that they do, and they're taping things together, and before they get to work on the really expensive vellum with the really expensive pigments and the beautiful things, they want to make sure it's going to work. So first, you know, artists do thumbnails to start with, and then you do bigger drawings, and you do a drawing to scale, and you see how it's going. But a piece of that project for any kind of church work is it has to go through a couple of committees and get approved. And you can see these, and they're taped up. So I would draw them. I would do a small sketch, which is what this is, and just make sure it was going to work. And then I would do a sketch to size and send that into the committee, and it would be ink instead of the super time consuming carving. And if they liked it, then I would do the carving. So here is the final not bloody river that we ended up with for whichever, I can't remember. This might be, I think this is the healing one. You know, I was thinking a river for healing. And so fortunately, we all ended up in a place that we could all be proud of the book and have it go well. which is what I really wanted. All right, my thing has stopped. And here's the final page we started with the small symbol within the landscape borders and ended up separate, and then she could assemble them and do other things with them, which was great. And then on the back page behind each one, they used the small symbol again. I just really liked the way Allison, I have to tell you, was a fantastic art editor. And she deserved a medal after doing this project, because she had me on one side saying, this is what I see in my head. And then she had several committees worth of ministers going, but here's what we need theologically. And she was the ping pong bouncing back and forth between us. And she did a beautiful job. And then when I held the book, I just couldn't even believe how beautiful it was. And she made me better. I mean, about 80% of my work is I see something in my head and I get excited about it and I make art, and people either like it or they don't, and they buy it or they don't. But when you are delivering things to other people and you have to please them, then you end up in this situation where they are asking you for the things that you're not seeing in your head. And it can be hard. I mean, it can really, I have to adjust my thinking. I have to come up with my first illustration job was the Book of Revelation for a workbook for the Presbyterians. And they took about half of my suggestions. And then about half the time they said, okay, what we really need for this chapter is a sea of glass that's burning and a multitude of people, and some of them are holding harps. And I'm sitting there going, I'm not really sure how to do that for you. So you always get some of that happens in these books. And ideally, and often, it pushes you past your first image to something that is better. And that certainly happened with the waterfall. And so I had drawn, this is a page from my sketchbook. It's a waterfall I had done the year leading into the book project. And the waterfall is the very first, when they came to me about this project, I just saw that pouring out of God's grace in baptism. And I didn't want a little sprinkle. I wanted it to just be this gushing, natural, abundant phenomenon for baptism and for grace and for all of these things. And so I had this sketchbook of a waterfall. And then I tried to put it into printmaking, and it completely flunked. I mean, and I thought, oh no, here is the thing that I most wanted to give them, and I can't, because I had not really done water before. So this was a huge learning process. Allison really helped me with this. You can see in this one, this is the first one, and I was still trying to physically put the red box around it and put the symbol in the corner. And we ended up later letting the graphic designers do the red box and having the symbol separate. And that took a lot of the pressure off having all of these things come together. You look in the bottom corner, it's not quite right. So here is the sketch. After several sketches, I think I did 2 carvings. One of them I didn't even show Allison. I was so unhappy with it. One of them I showed her and I'm like, I don't know where I'm going with this. And she helped gather some images for me and work with me. And this was the final sketch, just so you can see the process that I do with kind of an ink brush pen to fill in all that space. Because you have people, if I just send them a pencil sketch, they're not going to get that black and white feeling of what it's going to look like in a more finished way. And then here's the finished project. And I think it ended up, it was probably the hardest image in the book for me. And it ended up being the one that I felt best about. I loved the most in the end after all the work on it. You can also see at the top, there's pattern. This is what I really love about printmaking, is that there's a whole lot that's planned, but then the empty spaces I don't plan. And as I'm carving, a sense of pattern kind of comes to me and I get to play with those, and I really appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to walk you through another one. So another back door. They had mission in the world. They wanted a church, and I'm like, oh, here's this beautiful church. I was doing a lot of this out in Washington State where my partner lives, and there was this gorgeous little church. So here's the sketchbook, and I took that church and I made a sketch for them, and they said, that's not really, we want an urban church. This is a mission section. And I'm like, okay, I go to an urban church. Let me give you an urban church. So I gave them Idlewild with the alley in the foreground and the FedEx truck, and they were like, ooh, that's a little more urban than we intended. Let's maybe back off the urban a little bit. I said, okay. So what we ended up with was an urban church with the telephone lines and the buildings in the background, but we created a little garden where there is actually just parking lot in front of my church. But again, my church got to be a part of it because that's where I have grown up. That is the church that has pushed me, encouraged me, supported me into making art about religion. I had always just been a landscape artist until Idlewild said, hey, would you be artist in residence? And really gave me both the opportunity and the support and the nudge to push my work further than I would have than I would have done on my own, I think. Another, here's Broad Avenue the other day, standing in line for Muddy's. And they wanted an urban garden. They wanted a community garden. And on the right with the birdhouses, it's the community garden in the place that I was staying. And they said, we needed a little more urban. So I went to Broad Avenue and I'm like, ooh, and I love our water tower. I'm going to put our classic water tower in. And they liked the buildings, but they were like, yes, but take out the water tower. So you can kind of see the progression of the sketches. Like the St. John's, but not nearly as nicely. I ended up doing sketches with tape on them to sort of keep the piece of it that I liked and then add on the top instead of recreating the wheel every time. And then this was the finished project. And again, I think it's a better image. It's for Allison's eye and for her pushing me to make it simpler and stronger. It's good for, I really love making the art that I just want to make sometimes. And then I really do love working with editors who are going to challenge me and encourage me and push me and get me to a different place than I had envisioned in the first place. And I'm grateful for that. Here's the finished page again. Let's see what I've got after this. Trinity, same thing happened with the front piece. This one is a small version of a print that was in the Dixon show. So if any of you went to that a few years ago, you might recognize these trees. And it was supposed to stand in for the Trinity. And I sent off the drawing for this, and the ministers said, well, there's a misconception about the Trinity. And the Holy Spirit gets downplayed, and the Holy Spirit is really an equal part. So the tree trunks need to be the same size to theologically not sell short the Holy Spirit. And Allison came back to me with that. And I said, Allison, theologically they're right. But if the tree trunks are all the same size, it's going to look stubby and not nearly as good. And nobody's going to pick up on the theological nuances, and we're just going to have less good art. So she went back to the ministers and she won the day on that one. So there was a lot of give and take in the process of doing this. Here's another give and take. This is the page that is open because I'm next to the Psalms in the St. John's Bible, and we did bird song, and these are the birds at the feeder where I was staying that I got to draw just out the window. But I was thinking those riotous Book of Kells kind of pages with all the spirals and all the swirls, and I sent them this and they were like, whoo, that's a lot of swirliness, maybe cut that down. And I really didn't want to cut my block down, but in the process of this, I also learned a little bit of digital work. I've always been just a pen on paper kind of girl, but I thought, I could take some of these swirls out in Photoshop and I don't have to cut my block that I really like the way it is. So I did that. I thinned it down once and they were like, better, but let's keep going. And so this is the final version that ended up in the book. I still really like the swirly one, but I have been able to print prints for myself that are the full swirls because I just took these out in Photoshop and thinned it down enough to the point where they were happy with it. All right, I'm paying attention on the time. I think we will just go to the end and then I will take some questions because I've really just kind of got one more thing. I want to talk about the fundamentals of printmaking. And it just so happens that the pictures that I have in my computer to sort of show this are the poster that I did for Dixon, which was such a rush. I had to make art about being at Dixon. So you can see in the top left, I've got you can see the pencil drawing on the very left that I did full size for this print, which is biggish. And then on the right, you've got the tracing paper that you can see is flipped over and backwards. And so I get the drawing the way that I want it. I trace the drawing and then I flip it because everything, of course, is mirror image. Once you roll ink and you have to have your letters all backwards, and I can't draw letters backwards, so they're going to look good. So I have to draw them forwards and then transfer it. And really, I do this for anything. I get the image that I want. I trace it. I write back really big in the middle of every single sheet of tracing paper 10 years in. So I remember to flip it because I've done that a couple of times and carved it and been like, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted it the other way. And then in the middle is the carved block. At the bottom, you can see a close-up of letters are always fiddly to carve. And there's a reason they make wood type. And I have some of that too. And sometimes I use that. But sometimes it's fun to carve the letters, but it's fiddly. And on the right-hand side, you can see the block, and you can see how it's like that rubber stamp. So anything that I've cut away is white. And anything I roll the ink on, the ink sticks, and that's going to be the dark space. The black was just for proofing. I ended up doing this in a number of colors. It's fun. That's the other thing about printmaking, is you don't just get one painting. You can play with it with a bunch of different colors. And I did a whole bunch of different colors for this one. And the gold and red one was the one that the Dixon really liked. And they made this really beautiful banner that hung up on Park Avenue. It was just this great moment. But bless her heart, Laura Gray, who is no longer with Dixon, but she was coordinating my show. I went to her and I'm like, I did a poster because I'm so excited about this. And she said, that's great. We love your enthusiasm, but anything that goes out with our name on it has to have all the sponsorship information and all of these things. And it has to go through 3 committees. And I'm like, I should have known that after all of my church work, but they made it work. They took this image and then they made the banner and they put the appropriate sponsors on it. And I was so grateful just to have that hanging up in the world a little bit. So here, I'm just going to show you a couple more. This one, I would have sent them a sketch with the bottom of it, but the sky just kind of happened as I was carving. So there was a little bit of surprise for the committee. Unfortunately, by the time we'd agreed on the main image, the pattern and all of that worked for everybody. This was for ordination. The laborers in the vineyard. I went to the laborers in the vineyard parable and said, what about a vineyard for ordination? Because that's who we all are. So that worked out. It was fun thinking about the landscape in a really symbolic way. And then the very last piece in the book is the tree again, that's on the cover. And, you know, like the tree in Eden and the tree in Revelation, you bookend with trees. And they wanted to add a peacock, which was challenging for me at this size. But I was really, this is not something I would have done on my own, but I was really ended up happy with how it came out. And the peacock is a symbol of everlasting life. And I really liked circling back to the tree at the end of the book. And they had requested that, and I was really happy. So, all right, who's got questions? Lindley's in charge, I think.
Well, there are a couple of questions. I had a couple of questions. And well, first, I wanted to tell you that I agree with you that the very swirliest birds are the best also.
Thank you.
And one thing I'm always curious about with artists is when you first fell in love with art, and when did you start seeing yourself as an artist? I started early. I took a calligraphy class with my mom, maybe about 11, and I loved the pen on the paper. And the thing I remember from the class is not the lettering, and I never achieved lettering in the way that people expect you to be able to write when you're an artist. But the things that I drew in the side, I still remember a couple of those drawings. But I think the moment that I thought, this is what I want to do, I was 14. And I was taking a summer class at Brooks, at College of Art. And we had walked around the corner to Brooks, and there's this fountain. I don't know if y'all know it, with the baby in the bath, in the bird bath. And it's copper, and it's got that kind of nicely modeled complexion. And I was painting it in tempera or watercolor, some kind of water media. And I started painting, and the colors swirled on the page in front of me in a way that was better than anything I had planned. And I thought, holy cow, this is what I want to do. And I did. I went to a high school that did not have hardly any art, and I started auditing college classes at the College of Art in the summer with the college kids for basic drawing, because I wanted to get myself the fundamentals and be able to go off and be an art major when I got to college. And I ended up adding a religion major, which is one reason I think so much about these topics. It's really, this project would just hit all of my wheelhouses and brought them together. But I stumbled into that, and art was always the thing that I knew that I wanted to do if I could figure out how to do it. And I've been so lucky to get to do it full time. So. Well, I know that I think that you started out as a painter and then kind of went into printmaking. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but now in your career, are you doing more painting or more printmaking?
I'm doing a lot more printmaking. I do a lot of quick painting, like watercolors, which I never, ever, ever did for like 20 years because they're swirly and you can't really control them. I do a lot of sketching outside with watercolors, but I bring those home and I make prints from them. I did pastels was my first love. My first gallery show was all pastels, but you have to frame them. And several shows. I had shows coordinated by David Lusk in other places, like not in the gallery, but Grove Grill and Big Brinkley Plaza and places like that. And they were all pastel, but you have to frame under glass, and that is onerous after a while. And so I did start oil painting for him, and he was pretty delighted because apparently selling things under glass is not always the easiest thing either. But somewhere along the way, 2008, I thought I'm ready to just challenge myself, and I'm going to audit. I don't need to get a master's. I'm a professional artist. I'm not trying to teach. I don't need qualifications, but I'm ready to take a class. And I took survey of printmaking at the Memphis College of Art, and it was spring of 2008. And I know this because it was the year the recession hit. And I started that spring and I loved it. We took 3 kinds of monotypes and lithography, which I will never do again, and dry point and block printing, which you can do. Etching like takes a super heavy press. It's very delicate and you have to really push the ink down into those fine little grooves. But block prints, you can sit there with a wooden spoon and rub on the back of a piece of paper and you get a nice big print that pops from across the room, and you can do it on your kitchen counter with you and a wooden spoon. And I did that for 3 years and I fell in love with it. And by that Christmas, I had a whole bunch of prints that I could sell at the level where you might give it to your sister for Christmas, unlike a painting. And I had my big painting show in November. I was at Perry Nicole by then, and I had sold 3/4 of my first show, and I was feeling great about it. And I'm brushing my teeth, listening to the NPR business news, 10 minutes before 7 in the morning, the day of my opening. And the business guy says, well, the only word I can use is dismal. I said, don't use that word. It's my show today. And I sold 1 painting. But I sold a whole bunch of prints for Christmas, and it was exactly the thing that I was excited about. So between the fact that, paintings really went off the table for a couple of years, but also I just fell in love with printmaking. I love the pattern, and I love going back and forth. And I did this a little bit at the Dixon show. I will do a painting that is all about the swirl and the color and the play of it. And then you take that same image and you make it black and white, and you make it about the graphic and the pattern. And it's not at all, it becomes something completely different. So I love going back and forth, but I think at this point that the best work that I do is printmaking, and it's what I continue to circle back to.
Well, Rindy Breland wants to know if you have ever used a laser cutter on wood to make your blocks.
No, I haven't. I mostly use hand gouges. I have a whole series of different size little U gouges and 1 little V gouge. I do have a handheld router, and for very specific things, like all the little bitty circles. So that one with the moons that had all the stars in it, if I am doing something that is either stars or sand and I want a bazillion little bitty circles, it makes sense to get the router out. But it's heavy to hold, and I'm not that great with tools. I'm the same way with sewing. I don't use a sewing machine at all. I really want the control and the physicality and the give and take of using hand tools. I like doing things by hand. So I have occasionally, for lots of little bitty repetitive circles, I will get out the router. And other than that, I pretty much hand carve.
Well, those are all of the questions in the chat. But if anybody has any last questions, you're welcome to unmute and go ahead and ask Martha.
Somebody's leaning forward.
Do you prefer linoleum or wood blocks for printing?
I have moved to wood blocks. I'm to linoleum. My first section was wood. And if you're doing like Munch did these beautiful wood blocks that are super simple, and he really highlighted the pattern in the wood itself, the wood grain. Mm-hmm. But I do so much curving and texture that it competes. And you go, and I really like spirals, and you go around the corner on wood grain and it tears. Wood grain wants to go in one direction. And if you go against it, it doesn't like that. And I really like cutting spirals. Wood sucks your ink down, and I like a thick black velvety surface. I really don't want it to be mottled and uneven. I think there are certain prints, and Munch was the master at this, where that's exactly what you're looking for. But for me, mostly, and it may be a control thing, but I like the blackness, and I like being able to carve in any direction. And just practically, again, I am not so good with machines. I can get linoleum on burlap, and I can heat it up. This is mostly what I do with my iron. I almost never iron clothes, but I do iron linoleum. And if you heat it up a little bit and you use a thick metal ruler and just a utility knife, I can cut it to any size and shape that I want to, and I don't need a table saw. So it just frees me up to be able to do whatever print that I want at my own work table without having to go find somebody with a table saw to cut things for me. And I don't feel good about table saws for myself. So for all of those reasons, I have gravitated toward linoleum instead.
I have a question.
Yeah, hey Carl,
Martha.
hey Pants, good to see y'all.
Oh, good.
I want to tell you, I really appreciate you giving so much credit to your editor, the person in the middle who was trying to satisfy you and the ministers.
Yes.
That person is an angel. I know that.
Yes.
From all the work that I've done, my best work came from the boundaries when I realized what those boundaries were. And to hear you talk about it, you know, the edge of the paper and the size of the block and all of the things that most people don't even think about are really trying to help you focus your artwork. And I love your work. I've loved block cutting, I guess, since I was able to talk. It's something about it that it gets in my soul. We have a number of books. We have a favorite book, a Christmas story by, what's his name? Anyway, it's a famous story, A Child's Christmas in Wales. And it's all block prints. And it's just fabulous. We get it out every year and read it. And now we'll raise the book to you in your honor.
I agree that editors are angels, and they are the unsung heroes a lot of the time. I have really enjoyed, there's a freedom to just doing your own work, but I really enjoy the times when I get to work with other super creative minds. And Kevin and Julie at Dixon did the same thing. When I was working for my show, it wasn't as hands-on with every piece, but they came out and they did a studio visit about halfway through my creative process for this show, and looked at it and sat with me and talked through and pointed me and helped me find the right direction to finish off that show. And I'm going to do the same thing. The curator at Walter Anderson, I'm going to have a call with her in another couple of weeks. I'm getting a whole batch of prints ready to be able to show her, and then we will talk about them together. And she has a fantastic eye, and it really helps keep you on track. You go to art school and you have a ton of people all around you and teachers who've done this forever, but just other artists to drag in and say, look at this looks wonky. What am I not seeing anymore? And then you get out in the world and you're suddenly making art all by yourself. And you don't have those other eyes on it. And the internet has lessened that, you know, now that there's Facebook, because when I got out, I was like, wow, there's nobody to tell me anything about this. Now I belong to a group called Linocut Friends on Facebook, and I can put something up. And I did this a couple of days ago. I've got a print, and I said, all right, what is the mood of this that you see? Because I have looked at it so long that I'm not seeing it freshly, and I need people to tell me what they see in this, and they will, and it's lovely. But an editor who is educated or a curator really has gone to school for this, is an art professional, and can help you make your best work is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Quick comment.
Oh, that's one of my cards.
I love it. You
Yeah.
still carrying those? Are you still doing those?
Yes.
I'll go online.
I have them.
I hope everybody saw that. I mean, is that not full of joy?
That is the daughter of our joint minister who posed for me years ago. That was not Betsy, help Abigail,
Oh,
got out and just let me take pictures of her while she was springing around the yard. It's good to have friends and people who are nice that you can draft for
I
my
have saved that because I didn't want to write on it. It's so beautiful.
I have more.
Hmm.
Anybody
Well,
else?
are there any more questions from anybody? Well, if not, everybody can unmute and say goodbye, thank you, Happy New Year, whatever you want to say.
Happy New Year.
Happy New
Happy
Year.
New Year.
Lovely
Thank you. It was
presentation.
very informative.
Informative, lovely, heartfelt.
Thank you.
Mm.
Thank y'all for making time to sit with me today. This was really, it's always an honor to be with Dixon, and I so appreciate you showing up for it on a holiday week.
Thank you.
Amen.
All right. Take care.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Can't turn
Happy
it off.
New Year.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. And the slideshow worked. Yay.
Slideshow works. Yes, everything worked beautifully.
Thank
You know, a lot of times the day before is you let everything go wrong the day before, so the day of it'll work beautifully.
Yeah, the bad dress rehearsal. We had that, but
Yes, yes, we do. But it's okay.
thank you so much. This was a treat.
Okay, it was more of a treat for everybody else.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to close this meeting out, but thank you, Martha, and thank you, everybody. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.